Good afternoon and welcome to the CWI April Brown Bag. Today we have an amazing group of speakers to talk to us about a pressing critical problem in our society, and that is the school to prison pipeline push out for girls of color in school. And we have three great speakers: Sabrina Bernadel, who is a National Women's Law Center Equal Rights Justice Fellow. We have Daryl Baldwin, who's the National Policy Director of the Center for Disability Rights. And we have Valerie Walker, who's an attorney and the co-director of the group Rise Up Youth, Rise for Youth, RISE, it's an acronym for youth in Richmond. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sabrina. Sabrina is a graduate of the Georgetown University Law School, and she's also a former VISTA volunteer. Get her to tell you about Philadelphia and poverty. As the Equal Rights Justice Fellow there at the National Women's Law Center, she provides legal services and legislative advocacy for girls of color to ensure access to education that's free of discriminatory discipline, harassment, and violence from school-based police. Today, Sabrina will focus on how Black girls are disproportionately disciplined and policed in school, leading to school pushout and their involvement in the school to prison pipeline. She's going to explain the concepts like adultification bias and intersectionality and how they play out in the education context. Sabrina will discuss what advocates can do to ensure safe, inclusive schools for girls of color and all students. Sabrina, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Connie. I appreciate the introduction. And hi, everyone. Once again, I'm Sabrina Bernadel. I am really excited to get the chance to speak with you all today and talk a little bit more about school pushout, the school to prison pipeline, and how it impacts girls of color and Black girls particularly. I'm going to share my screen really quickly so I can show a brief slideshow while I chat. Okay, can everyone see it okay?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, so today we're talking about, among a host of topics, criminalizing Black girlhood in the name of school safety. Now, just to give us some context, some folks may not be familiar. What is the term school pushout? A quick and easy way to say what school pushout is, it's just a name for what happens when a school's punitive discipline practices and policies exclude students from their classroom, their usual classroom setting, and ultimately force them to leave school, whether that's literally or, creates an environment that is so negative that the student themselves has to take themselves out of that environment. And some of these discipline practices are familiar. They include things like suspension, expulsion, school policing. And these are the things we often call exclusionary discipline. So again, the things that take students out of their classroom. But discipline isn't the only factor that contributes to school pushout. And so I've listed some other factors here. Some of them include a hostile learning environment overall, which can mean beyond discipline, but things that are related to race and sex discrimination and other things that create a negative environment for students. Another factor can be improper handling of a reported or known sexual harassment or assault. And something else can include the denial of a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, under the IDEA for students with disabilities. And these aren't the only things as well, but these can be some other, contributing factors to school pushout. Now, what is the school to prison pipeline? The school to prison pipeline is a national trend of these school policies and practices that funnel students out of their classroom and into the juvenile and criminal legal systems. And this isn't a new issue, right? This is something that we've just given a name to the issue of historically treating students, particularly students with marginalized identities, like they're criminals, over prioritizing their academic success or their social emotional well-being. And this list here that you see on the slide is kind of a list of things that have contributed to the school to prison pipeline. For example, over the years, zero tolerance policies have become, have grown into, major contributing factor to the school to prison pipeline. And they grew out of the concern for crime, right? The harsh, like hard on crime in the 80s and 90s led to these harsh federal laws like the Gun-Free Schools Act in 1994, which required students to be suspended out of school for at least a year if a student brought a weapon to school. And while those were supposed to be for extreme circumstances, over the years, states have adopted their own zero tolerance policies, which have expanded the reasons for which a student might be subject to being pushed out of school, kind of without any strikes, any other lead up or supports before that point. And you'll see here that there are other discipline policies and practices that contribute again to the school to prison pipeline. And one I want to highlight in the list is informal suspensions, which folks may not be familiar with, but it's the practice of sending a student home, calling a parent, sending them out of the classroom, calling someone to pick them up without the true documentation of a suspension, right? They call these informal because there's no, schools often don't log these in their discipline records, but the outcome is the same. Students are missing school, students are pushed out of their classroom. And when students aren't in class, can lead to other things and lead to a lack of support. And then just finally, I want to point out the school-based law enforcement as well as surveillance and school hardening. Things like metal detectors on campus can make students feel like they're being constantly watched, targeted, surveilled. And when they are, then again, they're being taken out of the classroom and into these criminal systems. Now, this probably can have its own presentation, so I won't go into it too deeply, but some other scholars have preferred to expand what they refer to beyond the school to prison pipeline to the school to confinement pathways. I believe Dr. Monique Morris is one of the folks who have popularized this concept because there are other things that can lead to confinement and carceral experiences that go beyond prison or jail for students. So I just wanted to highlight that. And with each of these issues I've mentioned so far, push out, school to prison pipeline, the school to confinement pathways, students of color, LGBTQI+ students, and students with disabilities tend to be the most targeted and criminalized, more so than their white peers, even for behaviors that educators typically would maybe just have minor discipline for, or may not even penalize for white students. So just want to highlight that as well. Now, when we're talking about Black girls, the part of the problem and the main problem is that school discipline policies and practices are often rooted in and enforced with racism and sexism. And when I say that they're rooted in, so you have policies that can be neutral on their face. So you might say no head wraps, as part of your dress code, which doesn't mention anything about race or sex specifically. But we know that the impact is rooted, first of all, it's rooted in racism against certain fashion or other, choices of dress that are not rooted in white cultural norms, that are enforced with racism and sexism because they're most likely to impact Black girls, for example. And so this has led Black girls to be overrepresented in every aspect of the school discipline continuum. So we're talking about everything from informal suspensions all the way to school-based arrest and more, and school-based violence at the hands of school police or other administrators. And a lot of this stems back to what is called adultification bias. And this is a bias that culturally research has found folks have when they perceive Black girls as less innocent than or less in need of care than their white peers. It starts when girls are as young as 5 years old. Research has shown that folks start to see Black girls as less innocent and less in need of care. Now, how does this play out? It means that when we're talking about school discipline, Black girls are more likely to receive infractions for things that are subjective and have no have no real definition on their own unless it's interpreted by an administrator or a school official or an educator with this, and it's interpreted through this bias. So there are things like school disturbance or obedience, dress codes, things where, you know, when adults are likely to see Black girls as louder, more defiant, more sexually knowledgeable. So when kids are all being loud in a room, we're more likely to point out the Black girl as the school disturbance, for example. And, you know, this has become more, you know, a lot of this problem has become more common. You know, the issue comes up often with Black boys and how they are disproportionately disciplined. There's often a significant lack of conversation and research around how Black girls are represented. But in fact, what is interesting is that compared to the national enrollment of girls in school, the problem is quite severe as well for them. When you look at rates of discipline between white girls and Black girls and white boys and Black boys, the gap in between the discipline rate, you know, the disparity is actually much broader when you're comparing Black girls to white girls in school discipline. And when we're talking about school policing, this often means that school police are more likely to arrest and detain Black girls for things that are often normal childlike behavior. So what are some stats? When compared to white girls, Black girls are 3 times more likely to receive corporal punishment, 5 times more likely to be suspended, 3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement, 4 times more likely to be arrested in school. Despite the lack of evidence that Black girls do anything different or cause any more frequent or serious misbehavior than any other of their peers in the classroom. And I can speak to a few examples, you know, in terms of school policing. There have been examples of, there was an example of a 6-year-old a year or 2 ago in Orlando, Florida, who was arrested because she was throwing a tantrum. There was a girl a year or 2 ago who was arrested because she pointed her fingers in the shape of a finger gun, as if kids don't play, you know, play make believe and do things like that. There was an SRO sent to a Black girl's home because she was failing her virtual ceramics class. You know, things where like this sort of interaction is so unnecessary and not likely to happen with other students. And so, you know, just wanted to highlight some examples of where we've seen this play out in real life in real time. Now, we can't have this conversation, I think, for the whole day. We can't have a conversation about push out and school to prison pipeline without talking about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term coined by legal scholar and feminist Kimberly Crenshaw. I like this quote that was pulled from a recent article she was interviewed for. She says, "It's not identity politics on steroids. It is not a mechanism to turn white men into the new pariahs. It's basically a lens, a prism, for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts." And so here, what Dr. Crenshaw is trying to say is that we walk through the world every single day as every part of our identity, right? I walk through this world every day as a woman, a cisgender, Haitian American, first generation Haitian American person. I don't walk through the world as one of those things at any one time. So people perceive me, interact with me, and you know, perceive me and interact with me based on who I am at all times. And so in the classroom, this is the same thing, right? You don't walk in as just one part of yourself. You are experiencing the world, and students are experiencing their classrooms as their full selves. So when we're talking about Black girls, they're not just walking in as Black students, and they're not just walking in as girls. They're walking in as Black girls. And there can be other layers there as well, right? They may be Black girls with disabilities. They may be Black trans girls with disabilities. And so any sort of bias against them is going to live and it be exacerbated by the different levels based on what identities they hold. And so when we're talking about it in the classroom, and with Black girls specifically, we know that Black girls receive harsher discipline as a result of a combination of sex and race-based stereotypes. And you often see this in the realm of the law, where it's very limited because there's a tendency to compare the experiences of all Black students to all white students to test for race discrimination. So you might look at the scope of it all and say, Black boys aren't doing, they're not doing that bad, so Black girls should be okay too. And when you're testing girls to boys, same thing, right? If white girls are doing okay, you're going to say white girls are doing fine, but Black girls may not be doing fine. And so I found this quote it's a Title VII case, but it's relevant here, where the court said discrimination against Black females can exist even in the absence of discrimination against Black men or white women. And this is what we have to start wrapping our minds around. Not just in the aspect of Black girls, but with all students, right? There can be, if you're looking at on one plane, yes, there may not be discrimination. But if you're looking on an axis of multiple planes, there may be discrimination at the cross of different intersecting identities.
That's a great quote.
Thank you. Now, what happens when we're talking about students who are pushed out of school, students who are pushed into criminal systems? There are collateral consequences. Now, the first is just the basic one that anyone could guess, right? You lose school time, you lose instruction time. Now, this quote here, the first bullet I have here, research in 2019 found that students nationally lost over 11 million days of instruction because of out-of-school suspensions they received. In other words, this 11 million days is equal to 66 million hours. Or, in other words, 63,000 school years were missed over the course of one school year because of out-of-school suspension. And let me highlight that this statistic is actually under-inclusive because it's just talking about out-of-school suspension. It's not even talking about lost instruction due to in-school suspension, informal suspension, expulsion, and any other version of push out from the classroom that a student might experience. So just keep that in mind, that the number is exponentially larger than 11 million days lost in one school year. Other collateral consequences relating to exclusionary discipline, policing, push out. We have research showing that students experience lower academic performance, lower school engagement, increased chronic absenteeism. Students have a lower likelihood of graduating. In fact, I know that one school arrest or one school suspension makes a student twice as likely to leave school before graduating high school. It makes students less likely to enroll in a four-year college. There's the negative impact on college admissions, right? And federal financial aid. There are schools that will ask whether you have a criminal record, or they will look at your disciplinary record. Certain, FAFSA, things that students rely on, there may be barriers to getting federal financial aid to school based on a criminal record. And then we do have data that shows that you have a higher likelihood of being involved in the juvenile or criminal legal system, even if it isn't directly from a school-based arrest, but just time out of school can lead to things that make you more likely to experience, be involved with those systems. I had our research team also pull up some other numbers, and they found that one woman can lose at least $912,000 over a 40-year career if that woman does not have a high school diploma. That's almost $1 million lost And I'm sure, that that's probably a lower end estimate, but think about that over the course of your career, someone who does not have a high school diploma, a woman particularly, may be losing at least $1 million in earnings, almost. That's a severe economic loss for girls who are pushed out of school and don't get a chance to complete their secondary education. And then again, I have this here. This also probably requires its own presentation, but there are implications related to what's called the school to deportation pipeline. And that means that students, again, remember intersectionality, right? You may be a Black girl or a Latina girl. You may be any girl from anywhere with immigrant status of your own, or your family has a level of an immigrant status. And when you have school police and other elements of surveillance, including from ICE and other partnerships with the federal government, students are at risk of also this discipline pipeline leading to deportation. And as you can imagine, when that sort of risk lies above your head every day, it can be really hard to focus on learning when you are quite literally afraid for your life or your family's lives and well-being. That can, like I said, that can be its own presentation, but that is something to also think about in terms of collateral consequences. Really briefly, I just want to talk about the impact of the pandemic. Since the start of this coronavirus pandemic, students are facing burdens, traumas that they have never experienced before, on top of all the other stresses and burdens they already had. And that includes, loss of family members, loved ones, particularly with disproportionate rates of death in Black and Brown communities. High unemployment, we have the she session going on, and particularly for young women and girls of color. There was a great article in the New York Times that came out a few months ago called "No Time to Be a Child," which highlighted how Black girls have taken on increased caretaker roles because of the pandemic for sick relatives, young siblings, again, which can distract from education and just put other burdens on someone who might be young and would like to focus on their studies. And you have isolation, missed milestones, things that are important for young people and their development, as well as negative impacts on mental health, causing children and teens to experience increases in anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicidal thoughts. And some of the initial data that has come out shows that this is particularly high for LGBTQI+ youth. So what do we need? We need to divest from criminalization and invest in care. Now, really briefly, the federal government has spent well over $1 billion to increase school policing, hardening, militarization, and that amount doesn't even account for state funding, what states spend on these sort of programs. But what we really need to do is take that money, divest it from those criminalization programs, and invest it in things that students need to feel like they are safe, supported, and included in schools, including hiring school-based mental health and support staffs, establishing police-free schools, and implementing restorative programs, which are non-punitive frameworks with roots in different Indigenous cultures around the world that bring together a victim and the wrongdoer to acknowledge the harm that has occurred, center the victim's needs, and create a plan for the wrongdoer to repair the harm. So that's just one example of something that has shown to be successful in schools. We need culturally relevant and inclusive and sustaining curriculum. We need supportive measures for students who report sexual assault and ongoing trainings for educators and youth professionals on bias and ways to support youth and be culturally affirming. And finally, what can advocates do? There's a realm of things, this is an under-inclusive slide, but if you have access to your local policymakers, your school leaders, if you're a parent, if you're a student-facing professional or worker, talk to school leaders and policymakers, go to those board meetings, those town halls, tell them that, testing limits, acting on impulse, acting out is normal youth behavior. And this is particularly related to how students are responding to the last 2 traumatic years, and likely will be for the next few years when they experience trauma. What they need is a pivot from being punitive to being trauma responsive. They need to implement evidence-based and trauma-informed programs. Advocates should be asking for crisis and de-escalation interventions, not school police, right? Police should not be involved in average everyday discipline. They shouldn't be involved in schools at all. We should be looking for healthy ways for students to regulate their emotions and express themselves and resolve conflicts in ways that are productive. And then also, if you have, if you are in the space where you work with students or you have this direct experience, please speak up in the care versus criminalization debate. Folks, legislators, I do a lot of work on the Hill. Legislators are asking, what are the school psychologists saying? What are the educators saying? They want to hear from you all. They want to hear from parents about why we should be investing in care instead of criminalization. And so, these are just a few ideas, but happy to talk more, or, definitely can reach out on what else can be done. And with that, that's my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate your time today. No problem.
Okay, let's move on to our next speaker, who is, as I said, Daryl Baldwin, the National Policy Director of the Center for Disability Rights. She has her degrees in political science and public administration from Rutgers University, and her group, the CDR, is a co-convener of the Federal School Discipline and Crime Climate Coalition, giving her the first person experience with the school push-out problem and with a unique approach to it. She's going to examine the differences between equality and equity, look for the reasons that both political parties are causing harm in the school to prison pipeline work, citing the federal legislation which her coalition supports and those that they don't, and finally proposing the solutions and how we can, as a society, actually create a new world order where all people are thriving. Dara, I turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you. Power to the people, power to the people. Connie, it's always good to be in space with you. And Sabrina, thank you for your wonderful presentation. My sister, NWLC, is a member of the Fed School Discipline Coalition. So I see her a lot. We work a lot together, and she covered everything that we talk about in our work. Of course, NWLC is concentrating on women and girls, and we want that. We also want people to know that we also, look at LGBTQ, non-binary, and transgender women as well. So thank you for the introduction. Again, I'm Daryl Baldwin, Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. We are a CIL, which is a Center for Independent Living, a CIL, which are non-residential centers where people with disabilities go for services and things like that. And in that capacity, just so people know, we work from a space of disability justice, not disability rights. And the difference is, in disability justice, we center Black, Indigenous, people of color who are disabled. Disability justice started about 7 years ago, was founded by a group of BIPOC disabled people who were tired of trying to push this message through the disability rights community. There are 10 principles to disability justice. One is, as Sabrina talked about, intersectionality, right? That's our number one. And that, as Sabrina said, right, people live their lives in many different marginalizations. Multi-marginalized is what we call it. So there is an African-American transgender woman who's an immigrant, a refugee, formerly incarcerated, and disabled, right? They're all there. And so we do that. And the 10th principle is collective liberation. We believe that the work we do has to liberate everyone, right? And you will never see the disability rights community accepting either any of those principles. They let us know this, and we're fine with it. Only thing I'll just add to the intersectionality is I love Kimberly Crenshaw. She is my sorority sister and my sister in the work. And Dr. Crenshaw coined it in a academic fashion. She's the first to do that. But intersectionality was actually discussed by Ida B. Wells, right? When she was discussing the lynching bill, which we just got passed 400 years ago. She was the first person to go to the White House and talk about the lynching bill. And she talked about intersectionality, right? And so did many other Black feminists, as they call themselves, before Kimberly coined it in a written document and gave it an actual theoretical academic background. So I just want people to know that. But as Connie said, I'm going to discuss with you some of our work that we're doing in the federal school discipline coalition around exactly what Sabrina presented, which is school safety. So let me talk about that too. The definition of school safety has been defined by white people. It has been as in public safety, as in all safety in this country. And the definition of safety is not the same for BIPOC and marginalized families as it is for white communities. Whenever we do this work, as Sabrina was saying, yes, she says, you know, the Hill wants to hear from people and wants to hear from families. But at the same time, you have a bunch of people on the Hill who say, we've heard from families and this is what families are telling us. And when I ask, and Sabrina knows this, and if you know me, I ask, what color were those families? And they all get a little stutter and they start, and I say, and were those families coalitions of groups that we work with, Black, Indigenous people of color, who are telling you that they don't feel that their children are safe? Were you talking to the youth? And the answers are usually no, and they are not. And they are usually talking to white families. And unfortunately, those are the ones who get the voices and who get in front of the community, in front of the congressional leadership. And it's always about school shootings. Like that's the only safety in the school that is important. And what we've also seen, and this has also been evidence-based research and proven, usually when people are talking about school shootings and safety is usually in white school district areas. When they talk about school safety and it's in predominantly Black school areas or low socioeconomic, which is mostly Black and brown students, it's about the school safety around the students and how violent those students are, right? They even define our young people as violent. And we know psychologists and all kinds of mental health programs have shown, and evidence-based research have shown, that children are not violent, that they are reacting to the situations they are in. And that we should not be calling any child violent, that most children who are acting out or doing things need help. And as Sabrina said, and as we keep putting in our work, there needs to be more clinical services, psychological services, mental health services for our children. And instead of entering into the situation or talking about safety in that lens, it is entered into a lens of really how you talk about adults and what is happening around adults. And also when we do our work, we try to be holistic, right? And when we do that, we also, right, look at the entire school system. So that means from the principal to the janitor. That also means from the school and everybody around the school. And so when we talk to families who are talking about safety in schools and school shootings, what about the safety around the school and the school neighborhood? Right? No one wants to talk about that. And that is also, in case you want to know, that is what abolitionism is, right? I am an abolitionist and I am a Black liberationist. And the fact that if you fix and help out all of the issues that are harming Black people, you center us and you center specifically disabled Black people, you will resolve all the issues and concerns you have about other things. So when I say about the schools, when I talk to families who are adamant that school shootings, you know, that violence only happens in schools, it's an interesting thing. I say, you know, well, what are our students who are trying to go to the park, who are trying to go to a roller skating rink, who are trying to go out, who are trying to just go back and forth to school? Their route to school is not safe because of the things that are happening in their communities. You don't want to address that. You don't want to address the lack of employment, the lack of education, the lack of healthcare around the school. This is that is school climate. That is what is happening around the neighborhood and the school. And so that is our focus and what we do in the federal school discipline coalition. We do it from the streets to the suites, which means our members, who are mostly Black and brown organizations on the ground doing the work, tell us what is happening and tell us what kind of legislation we want to move. The coalition has been around since 2011. And it took us almost 12 years to finally take all the policy briefs and all the reports and all the things we did to come up with some federal legislation that actual members of Congress were willing to sponsor. And I'll talk about those in a few minutes. The other side of the conversation is also the punitive system. We in this country are a punitive country. The United States is punitive. And it is sad that we are. The way in which we resolve all issues that Sabrina brought up, even around our own children, is to punish people. And this comes from a history of punishment in this country, where we have the slave masters who said to the overseers, the way in which you get those people to do what we need to do is punish them, beat them, and they will act right. Cut their hands and arms off, making them people with disabilities, and they will act right. Take their children from them, keep harming them, keep doing things to them to keep them in line, and they will stay in line. And they saw that did not work. That did not work in Haiti, where they say, oh no, you're not going to do this to us anymore. And that did not work in the United States, although you're right, you want to couch it in the Civil War, was fine. There was going to be a war in this country. There was going to be an uprising, and there still is. There's a revolution that's coming, and people need to understand that. But anyway, that ghost of that slave master still resides in the United States and in our work and anything we do. Whenever we want to resolve people's issues, it is punish them. Look at when it comes to the drug cases in this country and all of the things that were happening around drugs. When it comes to mental health right now, we still have coercion laws. There are people in this country, several cities, large cities in this country, who want to do coercion. That is the way to resolve people who have mental health, which is what coercion means. You round them up and you put them inside institutions and institutionalize them, and they will get better. So this concept of being punitive even is in our schools and how we address any kind of disciplinary actions around our children. And I think Sabrina talked about them very much. And I think we as a society need to address how we think about helping people. And just so you all know, I come from the public health. The public health model is not the model, because the public health model is racist and ableist. Let us all realize that. It comes from a holistic model. And that's some work what we've been doing around interrupting criminalization. But anyway, that's how we see around this work. And also we want to have equitable schools, which is a difference between equity is different from equality. And I want people to understand and know that, and we push that. Equity is fair and impartial. That means that whenever you set up a program, whenever you're doing it, it comes out and it is good for all. It is going to assist everyone. It is fair and it is impartial. And the reason we keep having these programs that we have to reassess and redo is that the other side of equity work is whenever you do set up these programs, you cannot have a homogeneous group. You cannot have all white people. You cannot have all women. You cannot have all Christians. You cannot have all rural people. You just can't have all of the same people sitting at a table creating definitions and creating policies for people, specifically our children in schools. And we see and we notice around the country in our work and in our conversations, and Sabrina didn't say this, but she's a co-chair of our research working group. And we have some really great researchers around the country who are at universities as well as think tanks who do this kind of work. And it's come up and they've noticed that usually when they come up with these solutions, there are no youth sitting at those tables. And yet you want to create a policy in a program to help the youth. And we have to stop doing that as well. So we at the Fed School Discipline, we have a lot of youth, meaning those who are in school right now, usually I would say high school, some middle school, but mostly high school, to those who have recently graduated, no more than 5 years, right? They are still within that community, that school climate. They still live in those communities, right? Some of their little brothers and sisters are in schools. So we include them in that work. And we want the work to be equitable. We want it to come out and say it's fair and impartial. We don't want to be equal to others. And that goes back to intersectionality. My experience will never be equal to anybody else's, but it can be equitable. You can create something that makes sure that that multi-marginalized person receives everything they're supposed to receive, right? And that is the difference in that. And then also, as Connie said, I will talk about what we see on the Hill in Congress, let me use that language, that unfortunately, a lot of people think that, sorry, hold on, there's construction going on here. I'm gonna close my door. Okay, there we go. That we see people who ask us about our legislations, which our legislations are definitely debunking this system that we have set up already. So you know what, let me do that first. I'll talk about the bills we have. So we have one, counseling, not criminalization, which is exactly what it says, right? Stop criminalizing our children. And let us put more counseling in schools. Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, is our Senate sponsor, and Representative Ayanna Pressley, Democrat from Massachusetts, is our House member. And basically what it says is that Title IV funds that schools are using, if you don't use it towards SROs, law enforcement. And just so you know, the large definition of SRO is anybody in the school system. And thank you, Sabrina, for putting that in there. And I'll put them in a minute. Anybody in the school system can be designated a SRO by the principal of the school. That means even a volunteer, those parents who come in and volunteer for the day, they can be designated SRO, just so you know that. But anyway, we want to move that money from bringing in SROs and law enforcement and push it towards counseling. And we want it to be culturally competent counseling. I saw in the chat box, I think Tanya, you are correct. We need to change the culture around the schools, and that is part of this bill. You have to have culturally competent counselors and counselors who are engaging in intersectionality, counselors who are engaging in racial justice, right? Those are the kinds of counselors and people we want in those school systems. So that's one bill. The second bill we're working on, and we work in a package, right? We know that one policy is not going to change all of this. The other is CASSA, Keeping All Students Safe Act of 2021. And that again is Senator Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, and Representative Donald Baer, Democrat from Virginia on the House side, introducing that bill. And that ends restraint and seclusion. And if you don't know, children with disabilities can still be restrained and secluded in your classrooms. Now, you cannot do this in any other area. You can't do this in your home. Don't try to tie your child up and think that child welfare and they're coming to your house and taking your kid or doing something with you. You cannot do this in any kind of clinical setting, a hospital, right? Acute care. You cannot tie somebody you can't touch. You cannot do this in juvenile, in any kind of detention centers or things like that. We got those laws done. We are yet to do it in a place where children are supposed to be the safest, and that is in their school systems. And it is a shame to say, I've been working at disability since 2009. And when I worked at TASH, which is an organization that really started to push on ending restraint and seclusion, the first flyer I found about this to send out to advocates was 1976. Let me say that to you again, 1976. And here we are in 2022, and we still cannot get schools to say they don't want to restrain a child or seclude a child. And they actually have seclusion boxes that they put children in for 8 hours a day. We have children who have committed suicide and killed themselves about this. We have had children who are still having mental health issues, right, out of school, but they were tied up and this was done to them. We cannot get this bill passed because of, as Sabrina was talking about, a lot of the unions, NEA in particular, as well as AFT, who still support this and say, we can't do this. We can't control these children without this. They won't make it public and they won't say these things out publicly, but they are the barrier to this. And I know I'm being recorded, and you are more than welcome to send it right to NEA. They all know how I feel about them and how they feel about our children. Because who is restrained and secluded at a higher rate? Black children, Black and brown children. And this needs to end. And this is where we need to hold these people accountable. Don't think all unions are wonderful and great, because they ain't. The next one is that we're doing is POSSA, POSSA, Protecting Our Students in Schools Act, which is, again, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut and Representative Donald McKeechin, Democrat from Virginia. Now, let me say this to you. Now, back to the parties. They are very courageous to do this. It took us years to get these kinds of bills put into Congress and to be accepted by both parties. Democrats are still pushing back on these bills. If you go and look at these bills, which I'm going to put the links in when I finish talking so you can see, you will notice, like counseling, not criminalization, we have about 15 co-sponsors on the Senate side. And on the House side, if we hit 20, that's a lot, because Democrats find it right now with the whole conversation of defund the police and don't get involved with defunding any kind of law enforcement, and school safety is SROs. Even the Congressional Black Caucus is not on board with this. Maxine Waters, we can't get Maxine Waters to sign and co-sponsor this bill. So it tells you about a lot. Like, everyone wants to say to us, well, where are the Republicans on this? I'm like, let's talk about the Democrats here. who we put in office, who 93% of Black people voted you in. And you are sitting here talking to us and telling us about our children and what's going to happen to them that is not important to you, or that you don't want to put this forward and discuss. Not even have a hearing on it, right? We can't even get the chairs of the committees who are in charge of this, Patty Murray, Health Committee on the Senate side, and Bobby Scott over on the House side, to say that there should be police-free schools. So there is a problem here when people think that parties are here for us. They are not. We need new parties. And I always say this, and people who know me, I say this, I don't care. Democrats are a problem around this. And especially when you have a leader and the president of the United States over there at the White House, Mr. Biden, who is the crime leader. He is the chief of crime. He created the crime bill. He thinks that he has still not apologized. He has never apologized for doing that. He just said he might have made a mistake because he believes in law and order. If you read his State of the Union address and how he pushed forward law and order, and he believes in funding law enforcement at a higher rate. If you read the FY23 budget for the Department of Education and the increase of money that he's giving towards law enforcement and towards school safety, and I use air quotes, that is defined around having more law enforcement in schools, that if you do that, schools will be safer. This is who is at the top, the president. So if the president is saying this, then therefore, yes, his House and his Senate, who is led by them, they're going to believe this. So this is the problem that we're having around these two bills. And it also goes towards people who don't really want to talk about history in the way in which I spoke about history. People don't want to hear what I said about slave masters. Oh, let's not talk about that, Dara, right? Let's not have that conversation. It's the same within the women's suffrage march, right? So suffrage movement. It's the same when years ago, before the summer of 2020, the reckoning, and I'm a member of League of Women Voters, been a member since I was 18 years old, whatever city, state, and now in the district, DC statehood, where I live, I have told women, because they want to celebrate the fact that women got the right to vote in March. And I would say, white women, why can't y'all put that adjective in front of that word? Oh, Dara, why do we have to discuss that? Why do we have to say that word? Because it is the truth. My grandmother and my mother did not get the right to vote when you all got the right to vote, women. Neither did disabled women, neither did indigenous women. Disabled women just got the right to vote in 1990. That was 32 years ago, right? And still pushing it, and still there's a problem. When we don't want to talk about history in the way in which history happened, which is a whole bunch of white folks before 2020, progressive white folks, that now is like, oh no, let's have this conversation. Yes, let's talk about the race. Until we have these serious conversations about what is happening to our children in school, all the great data that Sabrina put up there, that behind all of that is racism, is the fact that this country continues to ignore the racist policies that have been set forth and continues to want to only move the chess pieces on the chessboard. We want to take those chess pieces off, turn that chessboard over, and start all over again. And that's the new world order. So that's what I would like for you all. Like the recommendations that Sabrina gave are great. I'll give you some more. Please start reading some Black and Brown authors. Start reading about where we come from and how we discuss this. Dr. Monique Morris is in there. She's written several books on this issue, specifically on what Sabrina talked about. She's my sorority sister too, and I love her and I understand her work, but you will start to understand where we as a Black community are coming from about how you treat our children in school. It is more than a school to prison pipeline. It is more than all of these adjectives and things that are coming on. It is a whole entire policy system that we create from everything, right? From whatever we do around healthcare, whatever we do around education, whatever we do around employment affects our children. And we as a community need to do that. Another thing you could do is start listening, right, to some Black and Brown scholars, right? And we'll give you a list and we'll talk to you, right? You can also tell your friends to become members of the Federal School and Climate Discipline Coalition, because we do like to hear other voices and we will listen and we want to work with them. But we also want to educate people about how this is done and why this is being done to our children. And we also need you to start voting for and supporting candidates who think like us, right? Start telling people who you know who are talking like me, who are talking like Sabrina, run for office. And when they want to run for office, support them. Stop telling them like the Democratic Party, we got 12, I think it's 12 Black people running for United States Senate in this country. You don't know their names. Why? Because Joe Biden won't say them. Joe Biden and the DNC is not supporting them. They're saying, oh, they just can't win that election. Let us not come from a space of where we can't do. Let us come from a space of what we can do, right? Everyone thought that 45 would never be president of the United States, and we all look what happened. So anything that's possible, we can do. And so we need you to vote for people like us. And the other side of that is hold them accountable. Stop supporting and giving Joe Biden all his glory when he still has not done right by us. He is at 25%. 93% Black people voted for him. He's at 25% for us. And then with the cost of gas right now, that's a quarter tank of gas. He got a lot of work to do. So I just want to say that, and thank you for this opportunity to talk, and looking forward to working with all of you.
Thank you so much, Dara. I knew we could count for somebody to put the biff into this lunch, and that was great. I loved it. I'd like to introduce our last speaker now. Valerie Slater is a juvenile justice attorney based in Richmond, Virginia, and she's the co-founder and executive director of RISE for Youth, which is a nonpartisan organization committing to dismantling the youth prison model and ensuring every space that impacts a young person's life encourages growth and success. She advocates for youth and families facing the justice system involvement. Ms. Slater will bring the reality of the student perspective as she addresses the effects of school discipline policies and practices on youth and communities with high incidence of poverty, Black and brown families, and the overuse of law enforcement to address the issues resulting from a failure to resource these communities appropriately. She will also touch on the erasure of childhood for students in these communities by the education system and other systems tasked with supporting their healthy transition to adulthood, which they are not. So Valerie, I tell you to take it away here. Just be sure you unmute.
Yes, thank you so much. So I am excited to be here, and I apologize for the echo, but I am in a community center in their basketball gym because I happen to be here because I got a young man from school so that he could speak to media about his experience. He just got off of an ankle monitor on Friday. And he is now talking to the media to discuss his lived experiences, to talk about how supporting young folks and providing opportunities for them is a better response than ankle monitors, than the justice system, and then just pushing kids out. I'm excited about this conversation because you have now heard all of the robust language, everything that you have heard from the first two speakers. And now I get to bring the children's perspective. I wish I could invite him in, but he's on camera right now. But what I can tell you is this: we are in a fight for the next generation. We're in a fight for the next generation of Black, Indigenous, and children of color, Black, brown, and children of color in particular. That's who we're fighting for right now. We're fighting because we have all of these systems. You heard about the racist politics and the way that systems are created so that they can continue to perpetuate those same systems. They want to sustain themselves so that they can maintain the systems of power. I've heard someone say, and I wish I could tell you who quoted it, but they say power is never given, it must be taken. I'm not trying to say that I want to overthrow the government. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying it is time now for our next generation of Black and brown and other children of color to have a say in the way that they are treated in school, the way they are treated in justice system, the way they are treated. We talked a moment about crossover youth when they are receiving services from whether it's DHS or whether it's the Department of Health and Human Services, or whether it is the behavioral health, all of those systems of care that are supposedly supporting healthy development, that are supposedly building into our young children the resilience that they need to come back from some of the challenges that they have faced. Well, I'm telling you that that's not what's happening. When I am here now with a young man who is talking about how he was criminalized rather than supported, but we are building those systems of support now for these youth. Rise for Youth, reinvest in supportive environments. That's what it stands for. And like you've already heard, we believe that every space that touches a young person's life, it should be, it must be building the opportunity for children to dream of their bright future. And what Rise for Youth does, we are in the business of creating spaces for children to dream in. If they've never been given the opportunity, then we will create the quiet space, the healing space, the loving space that says you indeed in this space, you have the opportunity to breathe. You don't have to look over your shoulder. The police aren't coming. You don't have to look over your shoulder. It's safe. And we have made sure that you're not going to experience the violences and other things that perhaps you have been experiencing in community. But once children begin to dream, we don't want to leave them with dreams that they cannot realize. Then we take on the business of going to the legislature and demanding policies that are going to normalize dreaming and achieving dreams for marginalized communities. We're in the business of getting away from so many police that all we can do is police. Oh, it doesn't work. Every time there is a shooting, every time there is an instance of violence, the first thing everyone says, well, the first thing the powers that be, the first thing they say is, we're going to increase police budgets. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and hoping for a different result. We have been attempting to police our way out of the challenges that are being experienced in these communities, in the communities that are predominantly of color, in the communities that have been constructed to warehouse Black poverty. The communities that have been constructed to warehouse Black poverty, Black and brown and Indigenous poverty. You know, reservations, public housing communities. Yeah, they were intentionally built. They are intentionally, poverty is an intentionality there. It isn't that folks don't want to work. Have you ever been on public assistance and made $2 or $3 more than you ought to? And then all of a sudden, all of your food stamps are taken away? Have you ever been just barely making ends meet and perhaps dad comes into the home and then you lose everything because you have violated the rules of the game? How dare certain communities think that they are able to come up and out of the circumstances that have been created for them? That's the story that I hear day in and day out from the young people we serve. When the pandemic hit, our communities were the first to be completely devastated. School divisions that had public housing communities as their primary students didn't even have enough laptops to go around once virtual school began. So not only are kids not receiving the same robust education, but they weren't receiving anything at all in some instances in the housing communities because they didn't even have laptops. They didn't have internet access. And then the food that they were being provided, you know, because all of a sudden the school lunches became free. Can we just, I'm gonna aside for just a moment, school lunches. You know how some kids aren't able to graduate because they have school lunch debt? All of a sudden during the pandemic, you were able to feed all of the kids. What happened? All of a sudden, we can afford to feed all of the kids. It has never been an issue of whether you can or you can't. It's been an issue of not being willing to provide all of the supports necessary to make sure that every child has the opportunity to access learning on a full stomach. When I'm hungry, my brain stops working so well, and I can get pretty hangry. I can get pretty upset and frustrated and unable to focus because my stomach is growling. And then there are children who are attempting to access education now in this pandemic, still living in that pandemic space for here just a moment. And they're dealing with all of the traumas associated with now mom and dad have lost their job or just mom. And now there's so much more violence is happening in the community because people are frustrated. And what was already a volatile situation has now hit the tipping point. The pressure cooker has now exploded. And what is the response to all of this trauma? What is the response to all of this lack? What was the response to all of this poverty? Yeah, you guessed it, police. We didn't have teams of healthcare workers running in to make sure that they were supporting the families where mom might be a little stressed, dad might be a little stressed, and might be acting out in ways that normally they wouldn't, even towards their children. We weren't sending in folks to help deal with those traumas, not at all. We weren't sending in folks to say, you know what, we're going to make sure that, yes, we're going to feed you, but we're going to make sure that it's healthy food, and we're going to provide respite. We're going to provide whatever recreation we can for kids. That's not what was happening. And when folks started stealing, it's interesting when we look at kids who end up in the justice system, more than 50% of them are there for a stealing crime. That's burglary, larceny, and burglary, larceny, and I can't think of the third one right now. I'll come back to it. But when kids are stealing, it's because they lack. We're not having that conversation, however. We're not having the conversation about how much the children in particular that are filling up our juvenile justice systems are over 90% of them from the 2020 data resource guide for our Department of Juvenile Justice. Over 90% of them needed mental health care. Over 70% of them have been prescribed a psychotropic drug at some point in their lives. And over 30% of them have a current psychotropic drug prescription. Those are the children that we are putting into the system, and we're saying we need to keep our community safe, so we better lock up those kids. We better throw more police into their schools. We better put more police into their neighborhoods. The response to trauma cannot be police. The response to poverty cannot be police. The response to hopelessness cannot be police. Yet that's what I keep hearing again and again and again. Rise for Youth, we serve young people. We have a youth development academy. Every year during the summer, we have a group of young people. We introduce them to the work of many, many, many organizations. And then we also provide we help them to develop a personal development plan, a career cluster survey, and also conflict resolution training. We provide all of this. And then of course we give them the soft skills, how do you write an email, and what does your resume look like, and how do you address your superior or your manager in an office setting, or whatever that setting may look like. We give them all of those trainings, but then we also do a financial literacy. And then if they don't have bank accounts, we open the bank account, we put that first $100 in. And then at the end of the academy, after they've had the opportunity to engage with all of these different organizations doing the work, and some of the organizations, we've got law firms, we've got arts organizations who come in, we've got East End Boxing, which is a boxing club, but they also do mentoring and self-regulation training and those kinds of things. But all of these, we have climate justice organizations come in, civic engagement organizations come in, and these organizations, they are then, what I ask of them, yes, come and tell my young people all about it. Our young people have to have 12 hours of community service in order to graduate. So they're going into these organizations and learning more about them, because that's what we require. We require that you don't just come and sit and learn, engage. And when you find the one that's really exciting to you, then we sub-grant $6,000 to that organization, so that every young person is going to make $1,000 a month. And they're going to set it up so that they're paid every 2 weeks. We want to make sure that our young people, you're telling us all of these things that are going on in your lives. We are creating the pathways out. And then we ask, you know what, after that 6-month internship, either have that space created for that young person to be able to work with you, or you know someone who is similarly situated, a business that is similarly situated, and you create the pathway. You go with your arm around this young person with that letter of recommendation, that glowing letter of recommendation from you. You rubber stamp, you stamp this young person and say, yes, I vouch for what this young one knows because they came up under me. And make sure that the ones that are old enough, we work with young folks ages 14 to 24. So that's a wide range, but we give the opportunity to all of them. And those that are ready, we want them to be able to transition into employment, full-time, gainful employment, pathways out of poverty. We are determined. We will not let this generation of young folks, we will not allow the stories that they tell us to just be pimped out and used as if they're just fodder for us to get more money. That's not what it's about. I want the young folks to come up under me, but then surpass me. Go out and do amazing and great things. And the way they do that is that I don't just hoard the information that I have. I don't just hoard the organization that I have, but I open it up and I say, come in, learn, let me employ you. And eventually I will transition out and a young person will be sitting in my seat. The next ED, and then the work that they're doing, it's not going to be the same work because we just heard since it was in the 70s at the first, the first piece of legislation, the first time we started talking about push out was in 1970. Isn't that something that we are still having the same conversations now? Well, we're determined to change the conversation. We're determined to change the situation of young folks so that they are in the seats of power. We have legislators who are coming in to talk to our children. We are saying, no, okay, the PAGE system says you have to be in an accredited school. Many of the students that we work with, their schools aren't accredited. So it doesn't matter what their GPA is. There'll never be a PAGE in our in our General Assembly halls. So we're inviting the legislators into the Youth Development Academy and saying, make them the next assistant in your office. Let them be your legislative assistant and develop them until they can be your chief of staff. And then I have seen so many times the folks who have come up through the ranks then run for office, right? That's how it happens. We know that that's how it works, that you know somebody and somebody knew your parents and they get you in the running and then all of a sudden you're able to move about the building in ways that you wouldn't if you didn't know someone. Well, we're changing the game. We're introducing the folks that have the power to our kids. If you're not going to let them in, we're going to bring you in and then we're going to demand that you take them with you. Because we believe that if you have a seat of power, every one of us on this call, we are women of influence. We are women of influence, and it is time for you to share that influence with the next generation. I don't want to just keep hearing their stories. I want to hear the stories change. I don't want to just keep hearing the woes. I want to begin to hear the success stories. We have a young person who's interning with a Cadence Theater Company, and they are now, his internship is coming to an end. He voiced that he wants to remain with them. They are putting together his offer letter. They are putting together his offer letter. This young man who has a passion for the arts, who was able to create soundtracks for some of the work that they're doing, and then was able to sell the music and make money aside from the internship. They are excited to bring this young man on. I'm going to tell you what, it is incumbent on us to stop just hearing these stories. The school to prison pipeline, I'm going to tell you what, I have the opportunity to speak about the school to prison pipeline more times than I want to. But every time I have the conversation, I come with marching orders for everyone listening. Stop just hearing the information and do something about it. It's not to say that you aren't, but I'm just telling you what the lens that I'm going to bring. I'm going to bring the lens of these babies that are saying, I don't want to live in poverty anymore. I don't want the police to be the only ones trying to start programs in my school. I want them to stop trying to shove law enforcement on me as if that's all that could potentially help me. Stop creating. I've heard it called the cradle to prison pipeline. I've heard the disability to prison. I've heard the preschool to prison. I've heard so many, right? We also have what's called, unfortunately, the DJJ to DOC pipeline. It is time that we stop allowing the system to get a hold of our babies, because at the 3-year mark, more than 3/4 of them end up in DOC. I say that because at the 3-year mark, that's when over 73.4% of young people are reconvicted. But see, if the median age is between 16 and 17 for that first encounter, and you've been incarcerated, you're 16 or 17, in 3 years, you're over the age of majority. And so it's a DJJ, Department of Juvenile Justice, to DOC, Department of Corrections pipeline. And they have their feeding ground. People say people are looking at the 3rd grade reading scores. I'm telling you, I submit to you that they have created the communities to feed their system, right? It's those communities that they have stricken with poverty with no way out. They know that crime is going to be rampant, and they know that they're not going to spend the resources to make equitable the provision of service. They know that they're not going to do that. And they know that they're going to continue to criminalize our babies. Do you know that in our General Assembly session, we had so many things, so many bills. There was a bill we just in Virginia last session increased our felony threshold from $500 to $1,000. They tried to roll it back down to $500. How sad is that? That's a cell phone. And then all of a sudden, a felony. Tried to put an SRO in every school, to include elementary schools. An SRO in every school. Police can't be the answer. There's a bill that passed. It's House Bill 4, Senate Bill 36, that says misdemeanors have to be reported to law enforcement. They included even verbal threats. And then with so much advocacy spearheaded by our partners at the Legal Aid Justice Center, they were able to roll that back so that the verbal threat was excluded. Well, our governor put it back. The governor put the verbal threat back in. And so now here we are, veto session is tomorrow. We're fighting to try to make sure that verbal threat is removed, because we know that if we continually refer kids to law enforcement, and they're going to continue to be locked up. Another piece of legislation that we worked very hard on at Rise for Youth, HB 1197. What this bill says is that we've got to do a study. Our Department of Juvenile Justice is housed in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Secretary. We believe it should be housed in the Health and Human Resources Secretary, along with every other youth-serving agency in the Commonwealth. It passed with strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. And our House has recently, this last election, became conservative ruled. It still passed. The governor in the last hour, literally in the last few minutes of his veto authority, vetoed that bill. And tomorrow again is veto override, is our veto session. And so we have this huge push right now, trying to get folks to send a letter to all of the legislators in our General Assembly so that we can get a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate to override that veto. I keep saying we cannot police away the ills in communities that are under-resourced. We simply cannot. The only way is to start providing the resources that are necessary for kids to be successful. We can't keep listening to children talk about their friends that they have lost to gun violence when we are unwilling to do anything but add more police. If police was the answer, our communities would be the absolute safest. If police were the answer, communities of color, high poverty communities, they would be the absolute safest communities. But do you know what that tells us? It doesn't work. But they just continue to do the same things over and over again. So I'm asking you, please go to our website, riseforyouth.org. Go to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram page. You will see, if you're from Virginia, you will see the link that you can one-click action. All you have to do is click. The email is already drafted. It will go to every senator, every delegate. Sign your name at the bottom and let them know that you support a veto override. Today is our final chance to make our voice heard because veto session is tomorrow. But it is time that we decide that we will no longer accept police as the only option to heal hurting Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, poverty-stricken communities. Police is not the answer. Appropriately resourcing what we have failed thus far to appropriately resource, that is the answer. And it can begin with ensuring that the organization, the agency that is tasked with helping our kids that find themselves in trouble, the Department of Juvenile Justice, have them take a health lens, a public health lens. You've heard of the social determinants of health and how they're sorely lacking, failing for all of the children and communities that we're talking about. So we must take a health lens. We must. Youth justice system involvement is a public health crisis. Help us do something about it. Thank you.
All right. That was I don't know how we got this concentration of people, but every one of you has been absolutely marvelous. And you've lit a fire under us. For sure, I'm going to your site and sign the letter. If I have to check and see, but I don't think I have yet, and we'll send it off. And I truly believe that we still have enough people with common sense in our assembly in Virginia that we will in fact override that veto. I think people are getting sick and tired of the hijinks up there. So let's hope that's true. What I'd like to ask everyone now is, are there any questions that you'd like to ask? Dara had to leave for a message, but she gave you her email and you can call her. But Sabrina and Valerie are still here if there are any questions that people want to ask. Just unmute yourself and let me know. I think we're still in shock. It was great, Valerie, honestly. So, and I wish there were a way to extend your program up to the DC area, because people up here are always looking for interns. It's probably a question of housing for them. But if we could bring your kids up here to do that, that would be fantastic.
The ways to make it happen. If there are folks who are wanting to take on one of our interns, if you to come down and talk to our young people and that they would be interested, I would love to figure it out. That's the best kind of problem to have.
Okay. All right, let's commit ourselves to that. All right, are there any questions from anybody? Sue, I'm going to turn it over to you for a moment so that you can talk a minute about next month's brown bag.
Next month, we're going to also have another very exciting and important meeting that a lot of feminists need a lot more education on. Nancy Hogshead-Makar, who's an Olympic swimmer, gold medalist, and a lawyer who's worked for many years in the area of Title IX and civil rights, is organizing a panel. She's done a lot of work with the issue that is very high in many news stories on trans women in athletics and how does it affect cis women competitors. The title of the talk that Nancy is going to do and recruit other participants is urging sport governance to develop new structures for transgender athletes while prioritizing competitive fairness and safety for females. And Donna Lopiano is one of the presenters that Nancy's already arranged, and she's also arranging for others. So I'd like to invite you to do that. If you have received the CWI April newsletter, which we send to all members. You'll also see that we're supporting, CWI has already donated some to the GoFundMe page that Nancy is in charge of. The GoFundMe page is to help Nancy and her organization Champion Women, and one other person who's been sued for over $200 million by a former volleyball coach who has been convicted of sexual assault on minors that he was in charge of, and expelled from USA Volleyball and other organizations. What Nancy did is she let people know about his expulsion, and he has now sued her because he's complained that she has endangered his new business, which is with his wife organizing a volleyball coaching programs. And we think that good deeds like Nancy's in publicizing transgressors doesn't deserve to be fought against and sued. And we hope that others will support her. The GoFundMe page link in the newsletter has one wrong character in it. It's just a dollar mark. So if you have the April newsletter and want to go to her GoFundMe page link on page 5 of the newsletter, just if the link will work if you take out the dollar sign. So thank you, and do come to our meeting on May 24th. That's at noon, and it'll be a similar format to this meeting. And I want to thank all the presenters at this meeting. They were super, and Connie for organizing it. And we'll be summarizing it in the May newsletter.
And we'll be putting it on our website under the Brown Bags logo, and we'll also be putting it on YouTube so that people can access it and see it, because this was really a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Have a great day.
All right, you do the
Thanks,
same.
all.
Bye, Sabrina.
Appreciate you. Bye.
Take care now. Bye.